today I want to talk to you about a big question that appends to the study of Jesus, the historical Jesus, of course. And this is the question of 1 second, I just want to get this in the proper place. Okay, hold on. I'm losing my, okay, good. And this is the question of healing. Healing is very important in the Jesus story, and it's very important in the Jesus story because it's very important in the story of any religion and the formation of any religious culture. It's very important in the story of any charismatic religious figure, and it is particularly interesting in the context, I should say, of first century Judaism. You have to understand that a large part of Jesus's appeal was his direct, hands-on approach to care, to palliative care for individuals who needed it on a number of levels, right? Like any good Rebbe, trying to heal the spirit and the body, and to better people's socioeconomic conditions, of course. And that's sort of one prong of his approach and appeal. And the other prong, of course, is the teachings, which we'll get to in our fourth and final session. The question of healing is an interesting one. You have to understand that in ancient times, health was attributed to a good connection with the divine, and illness to a poor connection with the divine. And one could have a good connection to the divine by doing things religiously correctly, and one could have a poor connection with the divine, obviously, by sinning in various ways. And so there was an association of physical illness with sin. There was also a complete panoply from Galenic medicine on, but even earlier in various pre-Galenic traditions, of therapies and cures and correspondences between things in the world, right? Things that one had around oneself that would be used as drugs to heal or as poisons to harm. People's psychological states, which were attributed to demons, as we'll see in a second, and the question of a person's moral spiritual state, which was believed to bear upon one's physical state as well. And so there were very few distinctions between physicians and religious figures in a sort of basic sense. There was no sense of healing without the aid of the gods or without the aid of God. But there were distinctions made between healers who claimed that the efficacy of their healing came from the various factors that they found in the world, drugs and poisons, and how they used them, and other healers who claimed, or it was claimed of them, that the healing came from some power inside themselves, some kind of connection with the gods or with God. Jesus is this latter kind of healer. And we, in a second, we'll get to the odd title of this session, which is called Here's Spit in Your Eye. But first I want to ask you to think about your image from all those gospel movies, right? Those Jesus movies and musicals and paintings, right? Of who Jesus is. So think of Jesus generally as an even-tempered, loving, tall, probably not, right? Blonde, probably not, light-skinned, probably not, blue-eyed, probably not, a figure of charismatic power in that way, that sort of gentle Presbyterian minister. Of course, it is unlikely, or I wouldn't say impossible, but unlikely that Jesus was tall or blonde or blue-eyed. He was probably a short, dark Jew, given where and when he was born and lived. Every few years, Time magazine reconstructs. They said, "This is the face of Jesus," and they reconstruct, quote unquote, Jesus's face as some kind of Arab or Semitic-looking Middle Easterner. Fair enough. But that attitude that Jesus heals with the love, that Jesus is little Lord Jesus, meek and mild, as he's called, really can be disproved by a number of places in the Gospels. There are certain places where you might expect this, as in when he rails against his enemies or casts money changers out of the temple, or has strong reactions sometimes to his interlocutors. Jesus is a person who in the Gospels quite often says to his students, all 200 of you at this moment, right? Quite often says to his students, if you people had ears, you could hear this. What the hell is wrong with you? Right? That's not little Lord Jesus, meek and mild. And then we have incidents in which Jesus behaves in intemperate ways. And there's a lot of discussion in Christian sources about how to deal with this, how we explain it away, how we justify it, how it's actually a good thing that he is this way. But there's a lot of that going on. A place you would, please mute, a place you would not expect to find this is in the course of healing, right? Because the expectation is that your doctor is going to be gentle and kind and wonderful with you. So I want to look to begin with at an instance in the Gospel of Mark. Gospel of Mark is interesting, as I said last time. It is interesting because it is written in Koine Greek with an immediacy. So the word gar, G-A-R in English, right then, occurs very, very often, and it's written as if in the present tense. So it has this immediacy to it. And this is the story of Jesus healing a demoniac. Now, a demoniac is someone who has a demon in them. We would say that the person is troubled by psychological issues or unwellness, okay? So here's the text. They come to Kfar Nahum, and Gar, right away, on Shabbat, he went to the synagogue, the meeting place. Synagogue is translated in this translation, which is the complete gospel parallels. Sorry, we have to mute everybody. Okay. The complete gospel parallels is translated usually as meeting place, because that's what synagogue means, and started teaching. They were astonished at his teaching, since he would teach them on his own authority, unlike the scholars. So he would not quote other people. He'd just say, this is what the scripture means. Now, right then and there in their meeting place was a person possessed by an unclean spirit, which shouted, Jesus, what do you want with us, you Nazarene? Nazarene is somebody who comes from Nazareth. A Nazarite is somebody who grows their hair long and makes a vow and abstains from liquor or wine. It's not a Nazarite, they're calling him. They're calling him someone from Nazareth. Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, God's holy man. But Jesus yelled at it, shut up and get out of him, right? And then the unclean spirit throws the man into convulsions and comes out of him with a loud shriek, okay? Now, that's what I want to concentrate. In the King James Version of the Bible, right, 1609, it says something like, right, silence and depart from him, right? Or silence and depart ye hence. I forget which it is. You can look that up easily. And what's happening here is very different. This is I don't know, you could call it a tough love, right? Love of the patient, hatred of the demon approach to psychology, right? Now, it's true that when you go to a doctor and you need your the gashes in your face that have occurred because some kid threw a tricycle at you on the playground to be healed, you don't want the doctor to yell at you, right? But some of you may have been to psychologists or psychiatrists who take a tough approach, right? Not necessarily yelling at you, though there are therapies in which that happens, but there's a sense of waking a person up. And this is what Jesus does. Jesus does it, interestingly, for a couple of reasons, one of which we'll come back to again. The primary reason, I believe, is because Jesus thinks that this situation has been coddled too much, and it requires, tough intervention. The other, more subtle question is this. When the demon in this person says, I know who you are, God's holy man, Jesus generally tells people, especially in the Gospel of Mark, the earliest gospel that we have of the synoptics of the three gospels that can be correlated together. Jesus generally tells people to be quiet when they say, oh, you're a holy man. Oh, you're the Messiah. Oh, you're a son of God, not the Son of God. They never say the Son of God. Right? It's an interesting problem why Jesus would tell people to be silent. And scholars of the New Testament call this, of course, the messianic secret. And the messianic secret is this. Jesus doesn't want people widely to know what he's about because Jesus has a mission. Jesus wants to teach certain things. He knows that those things are controversial. He knows not because he's a prophet or even a holy man, but because he has his eyes in his head. Ezehu chacham haroeh et hanolad, right? Who is wise? Haroeh et hanolad, the person who sees the next thing coming. Jesus knows that what he has to teach is controversial, and it's going to end up probably badly for him. But he wants at least a chance to do the teaching. And so anytime somebody publicly says, oh, you're the one, you're the right, he says, shut up, right? So there's that shut up, and there's this shut up, which is a sort of combination of that and a kind of rough therapy, Healing in the ancient world is not necessarily gentle. If you have a stomach problem, I will give you a purgative that will clean you out, man. It will ream you out like a carton of X-Lax, right? Because we're trying to rid the body of poisons and impurities in a way that's visible and evident. Of course, there was some ancient medicine that was very subtle and very gentle, but very often it had to come with what we call visible signs and outward portents. So to me, that's interesting because it gives you a different view of Jesus. It shows you two things. He's concerned for the psychological state of this person, right? And wants to push that demon out, push that psychological illness out. Whether this is a wise course of therapy or not, you may debate as psychologists, as psychiatrists, with your psychologist, with your psychiatrist, but that was his choice. But he's also being self-preservational. In other words, he has a strong desire to heal, but he also has a strong desire to stay alive in order to be able to do the other side of what he did, which was his teaching. So you can imagine that Jesus as a person is constantly treading a line and balancing. He wants to help people. He wants to help people in the biggest way, as I'll show you in our last selection today. But he also doesn't want to generate too much attention to his quote unquote miraculous behavior because he wants to survive another day in order to be able to teach. Now, I want to give you one more incident. Oh, sorry. I want to give you another incident. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay, get it in the middle. Okay. Right. Let me just make this. I want to focus it more specifically on this. All right, good. Okay, so this is an instance of healing of a blind man, right? So what do we know about the ill people, the sick people who came to Jesus, what was the nature of their illness? We don't really know, right? So, this might be, in some cases, they'll tell you a person has been blind all their life. This might be a case of visual obstruction or cataracts or something like that. In any case, it is through the charisma of Jesus that the man is healed, but the process is interesting. This is attested only in the Gospel of Mark. They come to Bethsaida, right? And they bring him a blind man and plead with him to touch him. Now, most of Jesus's healings come about as a result of touch. And we'll see a little bit more of this as we go on in quite a possibly a controversial way, but they involve touch. Jesus also healed remotely and from a distance and sort of quasi-magically, which is another sort of category we'll discuss. But in most cases, it's through touch. So look what Jesus does. He doesn't heal him immediately. He takes the blind man by the hand, verse 23, and leads him out of the village. And then he spat in his eyes and placed his hands on him and started questioning him. Now, spat in his eyes, right? That is mind-blowing. In the Gospel of John, there's an account of the healing of a blind person. Also, in this way, Jesus spits in his hand. He puts mud or clay in his hand and he wipes it on the person's eyes, right? So there is a definite physiological connection, touching, moving the patient, spitting in the person's eyes, right? This may be related in one way or another to ancient medicine. So one might consider the question, how are people healed in antiquity? Well, for blindness, there are a number of different kinds of recipes, which usually involve applying things to the eye, et cetera, et cetera. And we have to ask, if Jesus is a charismatic healer with divine power, why he resorts to these physiological measures. And I would say that it's related to a couple of other things here. Taking the blind man by his hand and leading him out of the village, which you'll see is important at the end of the passage. And then the following perplexing question here. He spits in his eyes, he places his hands on him, and then he starts questioning him. Do you see anything? Do you see anything? Right? Now, you might have expected the miracle to happen immediately, but no, it does not. The blind man looked up and began to say, I see human figures, they're like almost like trees walking around. Jesus gets impatient. He puts his hands on him a second time and he opens his eyes and his sight is restored and he sees everything clearly. Okay. And he sent him home and said, don't even go into the village. Remember, Jesus led him out of the village. So what's going on here? Well, if you think about this in terms of physiological, allopathic kind of healing, right? This is about putting a substance, whether it's saliva or mud or whatever, on the person's eyes, and about a gradual process of restoration of sight, right? It's not immediate, right? But there's a catch. First of all, it's done out of the sight of anybody else. Person is taken out of the village and afterwards is instructed not to go back to the village. The second thing is that there is the application of this biological material, spittle, and there is this process where his sight is beginning to clear up, but then Jesus gets impatient and cures him immediately. Okay. What seems to be going on here for the gospel writer is that Jesus is curing this person charismatically, that Jesus's healing power comes not through the spittle, right, but through his charismatic healing power. And that is what is doing the trick, but he doesn't want this guy to be telling tales, to be spreading the idea that there is this God-man out there. There is this physician with divine healing power, because that will cause Jesus's mission, as we say, to be cut short earlier. So he goes through the motions of a natural or of a healing by a physician, right? And warns him away from talking about it. By the way, this is very much consonance with the connectedness that many rabbinic figures saw between nature and miracles. That is, if you watch the film, The Ten Commandments, and the sea splits, right? It splits in a second, and it's the water is like up to the sky, and everything you learned in perhaps in your Hebrew day school education, that the walls of water could be seen from all ends of the world, and there was fresh water among them, and within the walls, and 12 paths, and trees growing, etc. Right? But if you read the scripture and not the midrash, not the rabbinic elaborations, it's very clear that Moses stands with his hand over the water, right, all that night. And a strong east wind blows and blows all night. And the miracle is a gradual one. In other words, the miracle occurs through natural means, but really the issue is timing. It occurs at the proper time for the Israelites to be saved. This is a parallel. What the gospel writers want to say is that it looks like a quote unquote natural miracle, that Jesus is healing through the use of natural materials. But when push comes to shove, it's a different kind of miracle. It's a instantaneous, total miracle that happens through the charisma of Jesus and must be hush-hushed. And that's an interesting incidence. Now, it must be said that for all of these kinds of healings, demoniac healings and blindness, and even, as we shall see, raising people from the dead, people apparently dead, come back to life, there are parallels in biblical literature with Elijah and Elisha. Moses is called a miracle worker. He heals through a natural means. He collapses a tree into water and causes it to become fresh water, and the fresh water has healing powers. His prayer has the power to heal, El Na Rifana La, right? Has the power to heal. Please, God, heal her, that is Miriam, of her leprosy now. So these are well-known topoi, places, citations in scripture, in both in the written law, the scripture, the Torah, and in rabbinic scripture. You can find parallels for just about every aspect of Jesus's healings. But the gospel writers want to make distinctions. They want to clarify that Jesus does stuff that's kind of like Elijah and Elisha, but he does it through his own charisma, right? They want to clarify that perhaps in other cases, a person appeared to be dead, but in the case of Jesus's healings, the person really was dead. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. It says he had been dead for 3 days and had begun to stink. Okay, so there are not many healings in Jewish scriptures in which a person has been dead for a considerable amount of time. The gospel writers want to emphasize manishtana. What's the difference between Jesus and his colleagues among the rabbis, who are also healers? I find these stories extraordinarily interesting because you see in them kind of connection between Jesus's personal goals, Jesus's goals for others, the goals of the gospel writers. Now, if I pulled out here, you would see that this is a story. We'll concentrate in Mark that has parallels both in Matthew, slightly later gospel, and in Luke, slightly later gospel. So it's a well-attested story, as we say. It has legs. It appears in all three of the synoptic gospels. But this is, I think, one of the most fascinating stories of healing, because it's a twofold story that involves a piggybacked healing and, in fact, a revival from the dead. So let's look at this. Jesus crosses over to the other side of Galilee. He's been Sea of Galilee. He's been on the far side. What happened? Okay. Give me a second here. It should be blue, right? And a large crowd gathered around him, and he was beside the sea. And one of the synagogue officials comes, Yair by name, and as soon as he sees him, he kneels at his feet and pleads with him and begs, says, "My little daughter is on the verge of death, so come and put your hands on her so she may be cured and live." And Jesus set out with him. And a large crowd started following and shoving against him. You can imagine that there's a very strong sense of reality in this story, right? That there's this healer and he's in town and everybody is jostling to get a look at him or perhaps to get something from him. And there was a woman who had experienced a chronic flow of blood for 12 years. This is probably endometriosis, right? The deterioration of the womb lining, which causes a permanent situation of menses, which, by the way, puts you in a ritually impure state. It's very debilitating from a perspective of Jewish law as well, who had endured much under many doctors. Does that sound familiar to some of you? And who had spent everything she had, but couldn't be helped at all, but instead had gotten worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up from behind the crowd and touched his cloak. You see, she was saying, if I could just touch his clothes, I'll be cured. Okay, now there's a couple of things we need to note. First, she wants to touch his clothes, and we know that because the gospel writer is reading her mind, right? Is telling us what she had been thinking. And what does she touch? She touches his cloak. Interestingly, in the version in Matthew, it says she touched the hem of his cloak. And likewise, in Luke, the hem of his cloak. Sometimes this is translated as the fringe of his garment. And it seems to many New Testament scholars that what is being touched here is Jesus's tzitziot, the tzitzit that he is wearing, tzitzis that he's wearing on his presumably four-cornered pallium, a large toga kind of thing that he wears, right? So he's the gospel writer in the case of Matthew. You see, she was saying to herself, if I only could touch his cloak, I'd be cured. Mark, who says clothes. Luke doesn't presume to know what she was thinking, right? And right away, her flow of blood stopped, and she sensed in her body that she was cured of her illness. Now, this is very, very important. There's some interesting rabbinic literature which describes the question of menses and what we trust in terms of testimony regarding when menses have ceased and when a woman is in a state of ritual impurity, that is, she's had a life leak. Whenever a person, male or female, has a life leak, that is, they come in contact with a dead body, or they lose sperm, which could create life, or an egg, which could create life, right? When that occurs, they're in a state of impurity. They need to separate for a certain amount of time from the precincts of holy space, and then they have to reintegrate themselves by immersing themselves in a source of life, in a mikveh, in a well of living waters. And the question sometimes women have irregular menses, sometimes they have paramenstrual flows. And there's questions in the Gemara about trusting women's feeling about when the flow has stopped or started. And this is an interesting first century testimony to that question. She sensed in her body that it wasn't just a temporary stop or that it was a permanent stop, that it had stopped. And now we have a fascinating parallel. And right away, because Jesus realized that power had drained out of him, he turned around and started asking the crowd, who touched my clothes? This is fascinating, right? Jesus is like a battery filled with this divine healing power. And when it is discharged by a touch, he, just like the woman can feel that her flow has stopped definitively, he feels enervated of this divine healing energy, and he becomes angry. Who touched my clothes? Right? And his disciples said to him, you see this crowd jostling around, you're asking who touched me? What do you mean? How are you going to figure out who did that? And he started looking around to see who had done this. Although the woman got scared and started trembling, realizing what happened to her, she came and knelt before him and told her the whole truth. And he said, daughter, your trust has cured you. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Now, that's also another interesting passage, right? He doesn't know, he doesn't have divine omniscience. He knows who in the crowd, touched him. What's interesting is it's not dealt with in Matthew, but in Luke, Jesus says, someone touched me. I can tell that power has drained out of me. And in Luke's account, when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she had been noticed, right? She came forward and knelt before him. She explained why she had touched him and how she was immediately healed. And he says, daughter, your trust has cured you. Now, what is that trust? So Christians would say, and they would probably be right, that in the mind of the gospel writer, the trust is that she trusted in Jesus, that Jesus had divine power and she trusted in that divine power. But it's not quite that simple, because the demonstration of her trust is only internal. We can't possibly know that, right? But what tips the scale in her favor is that she comes forward. In Mark's gospel, of her own accord. In Luke's gospel, she comes forward because she thinks Jesus has ratted her out, you see? But in Mark's gospel, probably the older version, right? She comes forth of her own accord, and Jesus is like, wow, if you're that forthcoming a person, you deserve this healing. So this is just a parenthetical side event in the larger event, because while he's still speaking, the synagogue official, you remember him? People came up, approached and said to the synagogue official, your daughter has died. Why keep bothering the teacher? That's very harsh, I would say. When Jesus overheard this conversation, he said to the official, don't be afraid, just have trust. Now, this word trust is usually translated how? Faith, right? But probably Jesus is speaking about emunah and bitachon. And this is an important side note. Faith, as Paul tells us, is the assurance of things unseen. The assurance of things unseen. Emunah, trust, and bitachon, security, are different. They are belief in a future result based on past performance. God, you freed the Israelites from Egypt. Therefore, I trust that you will, if I pray to you, right, you will find a way to get me out of this prison. God, you fed Elijah in the wilderness. Therefore, I trust, I have the security, God, that even though I've come upon hard times and food is hard to come by, you will feed me, right? That's Jewish. Christian is, I believe blindly, right? I believe blindly. The assurance of things unseen. Jewish is, I believe on the basis of my history. And so when Jesus says trust, he's not talking yet about this thing that's invented by lady Christians, by Paul, right? Which is about this sort of unseeing faith. He's talking about have trust. Why have trust? Because Elijah, Elisha, raised people from the dead. You should have trust. Now, again, he wouldn't let anyone follow along with him except Peter and James and John, James's brother, some of his Talmidim, his students. When they came to the official's house, he notices, remember Mark is written in the present tense, a lot of clamor and people crying and wailing, and he goes in and he says to them, why are you carrying on like this? The child hasn't died. She's sleeping. Jesus hasn't yet seen the child. We don't know. These are small rooms, right? Jesus probably looked at the situation and determined one of two things. Either he determined that the child is in a coma, right? And therefore revivable, and he's speaking, what is? She's sleeping, right? Or he assumes that the child is dead, but he doesn't want to panic anybody, right? And he wants them to have a continuing sense of hope, right? So they start laughing at him, poor guy. But he throws everyone out and takes the child's father and mother and his companions and goes in where the child is. And he takes the child by the hand and he says to her, not, shut up and get out of him. Not that. No, he doesn't say that. He says, Talita kum, right? Or Talita kumi, which means little lamb, little girl, right? Talita is a little lamb. Get up. And right away, the girl got up and started walking around. You see, she was around 12 years old. And they were downright ecstatic. And he gave them strict orders that no one should learn about this. And like a good Jewish doctor, he told them to give her something to eat. It's a wonderful story, right? It's a story that has parallels in the Bible and in rabbinic literature. What's interesting here is that you see the psychological insightfulness of Jesus here. He thinks very carefully about what he'll say to people, right? When he's caught short, in the instance of the woman touching his tzitzit, he's like, what? Who touched me? Right? You know? And then when she comes forward, you see his mind shift. He's like, oh, wow, that's pretty brave. That was very, Luke even calls her brave, right? That's very brave of you. He says, you really deserve whatever healing you were able to steal, so to speak, from my battery, from running my battery down, right? And he's no longer angry, right? And here also, when they tell him she's dead, you know, he has enough experience as a healer to say, hang on, let me look for myself. Just be trustful, right? Imagine you go to a doctor and you say, oh, this person is dead. The doctor says, well, we need to have confirmation of that, right? So this is sort of expression of his experience as a healer. And then in the second instance, this declaration to the people around, no, don't worry, she's okay. Very important, called bedside manner, right? You want to give people hope for as long as possible until you've examined the patient. He examines the patient and determines that she's not dead, or she is dead, and he's going to raise her with his charisma. Those are religious claims that I don't need to go into now because they can't be proven or disproven, right? We're talking about a historical moment. And in that moment in history, he very gently wakes her up, right? And even though everybody's very happy, and even though most doctors, if they were successful at a difficult surgery or God willing, reviving somebody who was dead or nearly dead, or was heart dead but not brain dead, or any of the very wide varieties of what it means to be dead versus being alive, that doctor might hope to get some stars on Trustpilot or however we evaluate doctors, right? But Jesus says, don't tell anybody. Because even in this case, he's very concerned not to prejudice his mission. Right? That's very important. Now, there are some other interesting instances. There's one very interesting story where a Roman centurion, at great risk, I think, because the centurion is perforce the agent of the occupation, right? The occupying soldier goes to Jesus, who's the occupied subject, and says that his son is dying and nobody can help him, and Jesus heals him remotely, right? That kind of remote healing is well known to us from rabbinic literature. Let me give you an example. 1 second. This is Chari Habakkuk. Oh, do I not have the analog in the Talmud? Give me a second. No, I don't have it on this sheet. I just have Elisha and Elijah. I'm not gonna go there right now, but it's a story of Hanina ben Dosa. And he's renowned as a healer, and he sends his servant ahead, and by the time he comes, the apparently dead child is revived, right? And so the interesting parallels there. But as a sort of segue, since it's 1:45, unbelievably, and we want to take some questions into the next unit, which is about teaching, and it is related to healing. I want to look at this incident, and it's the incident of healing on the Sabbath, because all the incidents that we've looked at so far, except for one, have just involved general weekday healing, so to speak, quotidian healing. The one with the demoniac at Kfar Nahum occurred on Shabbos in Shul, right? But there was nothing that Jesus did that would have aroused controversy because of the Sabbath. Okay, now I want to be very clear. I'm going to be very clear next week on this as well, that the laws of Shabbos as we have them now, as developed in the Talmud and after the Talmud in the codes, and as we observe them to this day, if we're observant Jews, right, were not present or developed in Jesus's time. Some people in Jesus's time observed what you would call an absolute Sabbath, a very, very strict Sabbath, much more strict than we observe, right? They, in fact, some people believed that if someone was in mortal danger on the Sabbath, it was forbidden to save a life. Okay, there was a group of people who believed that. Most people did not. But within the ambit of what it meant to rest on the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath, and to guard the Sabbath, those are really the parameters of Sabbath observance, there was a wide range. And it did not come down to the parameters that we have now until well after Jesus's lifetime. So, it might be today that, I don't know, I can't imagine such a situation, but there might be some situations in which ultra-Orthodox poskim, religious adjudicators, would say that, of course, if something is necessary to save a person's life, then we would give psychological therapy on the Sabbath. But in other cases, just stam psychological therapy, best to wait till sundown, right? Or best to do it Friday afternoon, or best to do it on Sunday, right? Even psychological counseling, because the laws of the Sabbath have really gelled, and there are questions about what is appropriate and what is not. I think the majority of Orthodox poskim would say, of course, you can do therapy on Shabbos. There's nothing about therapy that violates the laws of Shabbos, right? But as I say, in Jesus's time, there might have been objections to people doing therapy, that is, casting out demons, particularly if it involves some kind of creative labor or activity. But it doesn't seem to have been an issue in the case of the demoniac in Kfar Nahum. But look at this passage in Mark. Then he went back to the meeting place, that is, the synagogue, and a man with a crippled hand was there. So they kept an eye on him, his enemies, to see whether he would heal the man on the Sabbath so they could denounce him, right? So the Gospels creates a story in which Jesus is this guy who's sort of outside the ambit of any kind of Jewish law, even nascent developing Jewish law. And there are traditionalists who are very obscurantist, and they are obsessed with the details of the law, and they want to catch Jesus up, right? This is probably not what the case was. Jesus was probably, as we said, a Pharisee. That is, he didn't work in the temple, and he didn't wander in the wilderness, right? He lived in the cities and the countryside, and he moved around a lot, and he taught and he healed people, and he was all for democratizing religious ritual and practice, and turning it in a humanistic direction, as we'll see next time. So he was within the spectrum of this group that the gospel writers years later make out to be his enemies. I imagine there were people trying to trip him up, but the emphasis here is, I think, excessive. And he says to the man with the crippled hand, "Get up here in front of everybody." And he says to them, "On the Sabbath, is it permitted to do good or do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remain silent. Okay, now what's the issue there, right? The issue is that at this point in history, that question of what one could do on the Sabbath to heal was debated. And Jesus is going to use this person as an object lesson for his shita, for his understanding of healing. So as you can imagine, some people said, no, you can't heal anybody on the Sabbath. Some people said, well, you can heal on the Sabbath if a life is in danger. Some people said, well, you can heal on the Sabbath because you never know when something might endanger a life, right? Some people said, yes, you can heal on Sabbath. It's not a creative act, right? It's actually doing good, and you should do good on the Sabbath. So Jesus is presenting the spectrum, and what we see in their silence is the unresolved answer to the question, not because they were resistant, but because there wasn't an answer. There wasn't a single answer at that time. Because if there were 10 people in the room, they might have come from different rebbeim, different teachers, different masters, and had different opinions on this very question. So they remained silent and looking right at them with outrage, exasperated at their closed-mindedness. So the gospel writer heard this story and heard that these people were silent, and rather than like us saying, well, they didn't quite know what to answer because there's, it depends who you ask, right? They took it as that they're closed-minded and they are all of the camp that you can't heal anybody on the Sabbath. He says, hold out your hand, and he holds out his hand, and it's restored. And the Pharisees, right, immediately left and hatched a plot against him to destroy him. So that's the straw which broke the camel's back. Okay. Now, what's interesting to me about this is this. This is a man with a crippled hand, right? Presumably, he's just there. It doesn't say he's in pain. He might have been born with a problematic hand. It might have probably likely occurred to him in a work accident at some time in the past. But the problem is that it's been this way. It's been this way. It was this way, perhaps from birth, perhaps from last week, perhaps from 17 years ago. Here's the problem. It's not a matter of life and death. Jesus could easily have said, well, it's like 3 now, let's eat lunch. And, it's early, Shabbos ends early, like 6 o'clock, come back, I'll take care of it. But he makes a point. And that point is very important. And that is the link between his healing and his teaching. And his point, and I'm not saying we should agree with it or it's a halachically valid point, just saying that this is Jesus's point, is that, yes, obviously, if somebody is dying in front of you, you heal them on the Sabbath. But even if somebody isn't, we need to extend the law in a humanistic direction, because if that person suffered for 37 years, 18 months, 3 days, 4 hours and 56 seconds, Jesus says, I don't want him to suffer for 57 seconds, for 1 second longer, even though we could wait a few hours and heal him, right? So is Jesus right? Is he wrong? I'm not judging that. All I'm saying is that within the developing spectrum of attitudes toward healing, Jesus is taking an extremely humanistic direction. And he's saying, some things have priority over the Sabbath, and some things, in fact, should be done on the Sabbath as demonstration, right? To show what is truly important. Again, I'm not advocating the position or agreeing with it. I think there's lots of positions in between the current rabbinic position and Jesus's position. But since we're talking about Jesus, I want to show you where he's going. And so next time I want to segue from these stories of healing to stories of teaching and see how they relate to each other. So now, Sophia, I'm very happy to take some questions. Let me look in the chat since I can look at it and see what's there. Mike's blah, blah, blah. Thank you, Ahuva, for your story of healing. Ahuva was healed by a healer from a skin ailment by using some of her own bodily fluids, but probably too much information. Okay. Question. So Martin H has a question. One moment, but Ari has a very important question, which is, would Jesus support CSP in our annual fundraiser? Absolutely. Jesus would be on top of that thing. Jesus would be wailing on that fundraiser. Jesus would be taking the $37,000 that you've already raised and multiplying it exponentially. Okay.
You would be wearing the hat.
You would be wearing the hat also. Yes, absolutely. So let's see. Can we take Martin's? Thank you for your kind words. It's very, very, very nice. Martin's question. Okay. So, okay. What if Rambam said he was reincarnated now? How would Jews react? That's okay. That's a good question. I don't know if it's relevant to Jesus's healing, but if somebody claimed to be the resurrection, right, of a long deceased revered Jewish figure, there would be some Jews who would think it was the cat's meow and want to follow that person, and there would be other Jews who would think it was totally heretical and nonsensical. So that's what I have to say. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Yes, Sophia.
I've got a question here from Elaine. How would you define Jesus' mission within the Jewish first century context?
That's really what I want to talk about next time, but I'll give you a little Vorspice. I think Jesus's mission was to think about 2 things. Jesus believed, I would say, that very shortly the Roman occupation was going to end and the Jews and everybody else would be occupied by God. And so one prong of that was, how do we get ready for that, right? How do we make ourselves particularly morally responsible? And Jesus's answer to that question was, we need to undo the abrogation of moral responsibility of arevus, Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. We're all intertwined, of intertwinedness that we see happening throughout, say, the book of Genesis, as we examined in our first class, and that we need to move this thing that's developing called halacha, the Tao, T-A-O, the life path, right, the way of Jewish life. We need to move it less in the direction of God-human relations, because God's a big boy, right? God can care for God's self, big boy, big girl, big non-binary entity, right? God can care for God's self, and more in the direction of humanism. So we need to think first and foremost, would have been Jesus's message, even when we're thinking about something as holy and God-ordained as the Sabbath, we need to think about that person who, even though he doesn't need to be healed this second, still I don't want him to suffer for another second. We have to be especially frum, Jesus would have said, in our interpersonal relationships, because God's coming into the world tomorrow, and God is not going to want to know how long our tzitzis is. God is going to want to know, did I see God in your eyes? And if I did, how did I behave? Right. Okay. So that's okay. A couple of other things here.
There's a question here. Have you had an academic discussion with Amy Jill Levine?
Yeah, all the time. We're good friends. She's been a guest of CSP. She's much better than I am and knows much more than I do. So if you enjoyed this, you should definitely listen to her and read her books and buy them. I'm just here giving you a couple of, thoughts. I mean, she hasn't thunk all the thoughts that I thought, but probably if we sat together and had a discussion of these ideas, she would agree. Because she's a smart person and she knows what's right. Okay, if Jesus wanted the cured persons to keep quiet, how did anyone know about it? Well, he did it in small groups. The disciples knew about it. Listen, Jane, you want to keep something quiet in a Jewish group? Good luck with that. That's how they knew. Do all factions of Christianity accept the Gospels the same way? Absolutely not. There's a wide variety of approaches to the Gospels, and that's a question for a course on Christianity, which this is not. Charles, did the concept of sins of omission exist in Jesus' time? Of course. The idea that if you did so, for instance, it's even in the Bible. Right. So if somebody does not bring the Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, b'mo'ado in its proper time, that person is a sinner for not having done that. And there has to be some Pesach Sheni is one intervention. There's a second Passover for those people that is employed in the Bible. But yes, it's a well-known concept. Amy Jill Levine. She's a major scholar. Right. Okay. Good. Excellent. Well, it looks like we are just about out of time. If there's one more question or so that's not a comment, I'd love to see it and to deal with it. And thank you, Table. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you about law and love, which is the topic for next time. Did the Pharisees see Jesus as a threat because of his healing powers? The gospel writers, thanks, Resha, the gospel writers make that out to be the case. It is highly unlikely. There were healers every other street corner at this point in time. That was not the issue. The issue might have been healing on the Sabbath. The issue might have been claiming that a person's sins were forgiven. The other Pharisees, let's not call them the Pharisees. Let's call them the other Pharisees. The other Pharisees may have felt that when Jesus said to somebody, now you're healed, go and don't sin anymore, that he was saying, I have forgiven your sins. But there's two issues about that. First of all, the priests in the temple had the authority to say your sins are forgiven, right? And so Jesus often says that, and that's, maybe he's taking the authority of the priests in the temple, but so did every Pharisee take the authority of the priests in the temple because they moved the priestly rituals into the home. That's the first thing. But the second thing is what the other Pharisees didn't like about Jesus was that he was public and demonstrative about stuff that they felt was arrogant, right? That was about him. And whether or not that's true, it's hard to say. Did Jesus himself believe that he was the Messiah? Probably thought that he had a mission, but you've capitalized Messiah as if I believe, Tamara, you don't believe this, but some people might believe that the Messiah is some kind of divine figure. If you ask people, what's the Messiah? They say, oh, the Redeemer, the Son of God. Well, as we know, in Jewish tradition in Jesus' time, the Messiah was a king or a queen who was a political leader. Did Jesus have this sense of himself? I think it's quite possible, right? Did he think that he could be the leader of the Jews, the king of the Jews, under the new dispensation of God's new, God is the new Caesar, God's new imperium? Yes, I'm sure he did. And I'm sure that got out too. And that's why when Jesus hung on the cross above his head, the sign, the titulus, was inscribed, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That was his crime, insurrection, right? The Romans didn't care about if he healed people on the Sabbath. The Romans didn't care about any question of what he called himself, except if he were to say, Caesar's rule is going to pass away, and now will come the divine kingdom, right? Okay,
I think
excellent.
that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Cantor Neil. And it's been a pleasure. I look forward to see you next week for our final and last, as we say, session. If you really like it, you can ask Ari to continue this because there's plenty more to say. All right?
Okay,
Take care.
thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Love you all. Bye-bye.